Good evening, everyone. My name is Liz Ralph, and I'm the chair of the Book and Paper Group Committee. I was supposed to find out where all the fire exits are, but I'm pretty sure it's just these two doors here. I don't think we're expecting an alarm, so please make your way off the premises if they do sound. And if everyone can turn off their phones, please. We don't have any interruptions. Welcome to the first Fred Bearman Memorial Lecture. Because of the overwhelming response we've had to this event, we've decided to live stream this evening to make it as accessible as possible to as many of ICON members as possible. And we're doing that right now. For the first few minutes, we're going to be speaking about Fred and this research grant, and the lecture this evening will start around 7. Just to let you know. Okay, so last year, the Book and Paper Group Committee announced our intent to provide a research grant in memory of our friend and colleague, Fred Bearman, who passed away in December 2016. We wanted to commemorate Fred by pledging to support his keen interest in research in the field of book and paper conservation, as well as his dedication to supporting professional development in all stages of a conservator's career. Advertising earlier this year, we received outstanding applications which were assessed by a panel of book and paper conservators. Andrew Honey, book conservator at the Bodleian Libraries, Oxford; Liz Neville, head of the School of Conservation at West Dean; Ilva Danjo, independent art consultant; myself as chair of the Book and Paper Group, as well as Fred's partner, writer, curator and critic, Dr. David Anthem. It is the intention that this will be a rotating panel, and I'm delighted to announce that for this year's round, Flavio, who is the head of the Cambridge Conservation Consortium, will be a welcome addition, so welcome. Congratulations must go to Jasdip Singh Dhillon, who has been awarded the first Fred Bearman Research Grant. Congratulations, Jazz. Receiving £1,000 towards his research that he'll be discussing this evening, and Jazz will be introduced by Ilva in a little while. The committee has been able to establish a designated fund with some of the profits from the recent conference in Oxford, which was an outstanding success. And so thank you for everyone who went to that. We welcome donations into this fund as well. This fund will be protected and it will be administered by our new fundraiser and supported by the Treasurer. If anyone this evening is interested in donating to the fund, please see Abby later on. And before I wrap up, I'd like to read this short obituary for Fred, written by his friend and colleague, Kate Holland. The true flavour of a person frequently manifests itself in small actions. Who can forget Fred? Not so much as instructing the young, but encouraging them to lose their ignorance. I watched him do this many years ago when a book conservator intern of mine with minimal English was struggling with a complex book structure. Fred and the intern entered into a deep conversation in total harmony and perfect understanding with an equally perfect result. It was a partnership in problem solving. The same ease and great good nature helped to smooth the occasional fractious committee meetings when he was committee member of the board of the Institute of Paper Conservation, the IPC, when I was chair. As we were contemplating convergence with our other conservation bodies, a quiet word that was unmistakable, small shrug of the shoulder, and all of a sudden everything looked quite different. On a private level, he was such fun. Having tea with Fred was an occasion to cherish. No, he wouldn't have cake, he was slimming. Well, all right, perhaps just a small piece. You could talk to him about anything, intimate or not. He was never shocked, he never judged. And my goodness, he was so handsome. Fred in his tuxedo turned heads, and I preened like an old dowager walking into a restaurant on his arm. Thank you for everything, Fred. We will cherish your memory. I'd like to now welcome Fred's partner, Dr. David Anthem, to say a few words.
It gives me tremendous pleasure to speak at the first Fred Bearman Memorial Lecture. And I hope it will be, above all, the first of very many. And after this lecture, I'm going to take steps to ensure that that is in fact the case. I could probably talk all night about Fred, and as we just heard, I was Fred's partner for 40 years, which is quite a long time. What most attracted me to Fred was that he combined extraordinarily different qualities. On the one hand, he was an extremely practical person, and on the other hand, he had a great love of art, history, huge sense of humour, which I shall never forget. And in fact, speaking of humour, I suspect if he were here now, what he'd say is, why the hell is a lecture named after a boring old fart like me? But that's the sort of thing Fred would say. But above all, Fred managed to combine practical skills, very high ones, with administrative skills and intellect. He began at the age of 16 in 1965 at what was then the Public Records Office in Chancery Lane and National Land Registry Building in Lincoln's Inn Square. And truth to tell, try to keep up a sense of humour, when he went for the interview, he didn't know what the job was going to be, but he got it. And of course, those were the days when it's worth bearing in mind that there were no women in conservation. And everyone in the conservation bookbinding workshop at the Public Record Office was male. And I'm very pleased to say that 60 odd years on now, the situation has been completely reversed. Some would say too much, but I won't go into that. But at least we've made great strides in that respect. Fred had a very distinguished career that spanned, in fact, 3 continents. He began at the Public Records Office, and there he became highly skilled, hands-on conservator and bookbinder. He bound my own doctoral thesis, and I have to say it was too long, and the images in volumes 2 and 3 were this big, and they're now in Denver as part of Clifford Store Museum's collection. I want them back, actually, before everything finishes. But he did a tremendous binding of them. He was a terrific bookbinder, and he learned these skills from Stan Darboff. He knew Bernard Middleton, all those distinguished people. And during his time at the National Archives, or Public Record Office as it was then, he worked on Magna Carta, Doomsday Book, and rebound a lot of the Bounty. And those were considerable skills. But then in 1989, I moved to Washington to the National Gallery of Art. And hey presto, just when I thought I'd left Fred behind, over he came. And in 1990, he worked at the Folger Library, Folger Shakespeare Library, where he oversaw the conservation and preservation of all 92 first folios of Shakespeare. And then, coming out of that project, his first book was Fine and Historic Bindings from the Folger Shakespeare Library. And I still have a copy of that book, and it's a wonderful book. It was published by Harry Abrams. Rapidly, he went from the Folger in Washington to become head of conservation at Columbia University Libraries, all 29 libraries. And the thing is, that Fred, like myself, overcame remarkable disabilities. He was deaf. I used to say to him, can't stand people. I've got my hearing aid turned up very well here. I can't stand deaf people, they're so annoying. He was deaf, and as many people may not know, he was also dyslexic, had difficult reading skills. But what is remarkable is that in the administrative position, as head of conservation at Columbia University Libraries, he carried out the administration, and believe me, administrating an American institution, particularly academic ones, is a nightmare. It's even worse than it is in the UK. He carried this out with tremendous efficiency. And he lived in New York for almost a decade. He returned to London. He worked in conservation at Dundee University Library. He did his own bookbinding at Dove Studios, and he also taught several times at Makerere University in Kampala in Uganda, Africa. So this is how he spanned 3 continents, Europe, the US, and Africa. And that itself is remarkable for a career of almost 50 years, half a century. Then he joined University College London, where he oversaw the move of some 600,000 items from storage to another new location. And again, this indicates that Fred had tremendous practical skills at basically organising and managing people, and managing and organising books, manuscripts, and so forth. And that's what it's all about. It's being able to do things in the real practical world. On top of that, Fred was a gifted communicator. He spoke in public extremely well. In fact, he used to say to me when he came to my lectures, "Oh, I see you learned a lot from me." And above all, no notes, no notes. You mustn't have notes at all. You must be able to talk off the top of your head, as it were. And I think at University College, Fred did extraordinarily well. He worked up to pretty much the end of his life. He did everything he could there. Quite brilliant at that. And I would like to think that this annual research grant and lecture, I would like to think that it combines both the practical things, the actual physical nature of books and paper, and also a sense that Fred had of history, of how books, paper, manuscripts, how they fit into a wider world of culture. And Fred also had extremely disarming abilities to talk. Whenever we went to art dinners together, I used to say to him, "Well, why aren't you in my league?" He would say, "Well, bookbinding, conservation isn't really in the same league as art. I mean, art, we're talking about multi-million-dollar things. And even the most expensive manuscript in the world doesn't come anywhere near what was paid for Leonardo, in quote marks, Leonardo Salvator Mundi, $450 million. And I said, "Well, I'm not in that league, Fred, sorry, but there you go." But my point is, as art dinners, Fred had a tremendous gift of small talk. And that's very important because very often I scare the life out of people. Fred was brilliant because he'd disarm people, put them at ease, could talk colloquially to almost anyone he didn't even know, and that's brilliant. And I want to end by saying that this is a personal thing, speaking from the viewpoint of a writer, which I am. I refuse to call myself an art historian because that suggests being an archivist. And to me, being an archivist is a kiss of death. And even Fred used to say archivists are very, very strange people. But they're very important, they're very good. But I have to say, the archivists I've met are very, very strange people. But above all, what to me I hope is important is that in this cyberspatial age, which I call the second digital age, I call it the second digital age because when the first digital age began, I don't know, 15, 20, 25 years ago, it seemed miraculous. All of a sudden, you could do something, and the message was there, the other end of the world. You send an email from here, someone in Australia or LA got it in milliseconds. You couldn't believe it. And then there were smartphones. Smartphones could do anything you like. And now they're like personal computers. That seemed absolutely utopian and miraculous. That was the first digital age. You could do things in a way that hitherto, it was probably the largest cultural shift from a medieval era to the early modern era of movable type, and then the Gutenberg galaxy. But then things got much worse. They've changed. And now cyberspace has become something of a living nightmare. It's become an insubstantial world of numbers, figures, passwords, things that pop up, don't pop up, the vagaries of Facebook, WhatsApp, and all of that. And in fact, I'm finding that cyberspace is actually now much slower than the old days when you simply signed a check or perished a thought, wrote a letter, put a stamp on the envelope and sent it. It's much more complicated now. And the point of this, quite simply, is to say that we're living in an age of dematerialization, of virtual reality. And it's precisely in that age that the manuscript, the codex book, retains a vitality which is absolutely important in the material world. And in my world of art history, people are publishing digital catalogues, raisonné of artists. And when I reviewed one, that of Edward Hopper, the American artist, I'd said that contrary to popular opinion, the codex will never disappear. The book is always there. And it was Fred who had, above all, this tremendous appreciation for the book as both metaphysical. The book is learning itself. It's a sacred thing in itself. But the book as both metaphysical and, above all, a material thing in the real world. And I hope that these annual lectures will preserve and continue this spirit of balancing the material and the metaphysical, the practical and the philosophical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. How can I follow that? The Fred Bearman Research Grant panel met in February of this year at Fred and David's flat in King's Cross. As this was the first year of the grant, it had been a bit of an anxious time until the deadline, because we had no idea what the uptake of this grant would be. We need not have worried. We were astounded by the breadth and the diversity and the quality of the application. And they were judged by us against the following. Sorry, Fred, but I do have to read this. A, whether they fully fulfilled the published criteria of the grant, which is very wide. B, whether the proposed research could have wider impact and legacy. And C, whether the proposal could be funded elsewhere. And most importantly, D, whether we thought Fred would have liked it, i.e., would the proposal have appealed to his wide interest and sense of fun? Of course, we could only guess at this, but we did have David to help us. The discussion within the panel was thorough and robust, but we were unanimous in choosing the application from Jasdip Singh Dhillon as the winner. Its merits were that it proposed primary research, highly specialized but with great potential to fill in gaps in the knowledge of South Asian studies and to be of continued use to scholars in the future. It also sprang from personal interest and dedication that was bound to inspire others. Jasdip is a graduate of the University of the Arts London Camberwell College MA Conservation course and now works for the Oxford Conservation Consortium. I hope you are as excited to hear Jasdip speak about his research as we are, and please join me in congratulating him for the award of this grant.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hello? Hello? Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to attend this lecture organized in memory of Frederick Bearman. The title of my presentation is The Dhan Su Kagad Project, a representative survey of the physical features of Sikh of papers used in Sikh manuscripts from 1600 to 1647. It's going off by itself. I will begin my lecture with a quote from Sikh scripture. Sikh codices are the focal point of worship in Sikh shrines, and Sikh hymns and poetry are full of references to paper, like the quote shown here. My interest in studying South Asian papers stemmed from my fascination with the world of Sikh manuscripts. Importantly, the period of Sikh manuscript creation begins before the Mughal invasion of South Asia and ends during the late colonial period. This essentially covers the entire chronological span of papermaking in South Asia. So a study of Sikh manuscript papers is of great utility to scholars of South Asian manuscripts and artworks in general. From the early 20th century, manuscript scholars and art historians have sought to categorize papers using a variety of labels. But these labels have not been accompanied by any type of technical criteria and are quite subjective. This study of South Asian papers sought to change this by developing a non-subjective technical system for categorizing papers. Since my primary area of interest is the Sikh manuscript tradition, I decided it would be best to begin with a survey of a sample of Sikh manuscripts. With this survey, the Dhan Su Kagad project was born. My lecture today will be divided into 3 parts. To set the historical context, the first part will cover the origins of papermaking and paper usage in South Asia. The second part will outline the Dhan Su Kagad project and share some of the key findings. Finally, I will finish with a tentative glimpse into the future direction of the project. South Asia has one of the richest traditions in papermaking, yet a variety of other substrates were used for writing prior to and after the development of papermaking. The most well-known and earliest of these is palm leaf. Leaves from the talipot or the palmyra tree, known as dari in Hindi, were amongst the most commonly used plants for this purpose. Although processed palm leaves were exported as far north as Tibet, in northern Himalayan areas, the inner bark from the Betula utilis tree, otherwise known as Himalayan birch or Bhojpatra, was a more popular writing material. Birch bark could be used flat and cut to the shape of palm leaves. Birch bark could also be folded to form quires and sewn as the codex, as can be observed in the Kashmiri tradition, and an example is shown here. At the opposite end of the subcontinent in the east, in the region of Assam, the inner bark of the saji tree was also used to produce a writing material known as sanchipat, in a similar manner to birch bark. Although very few examples survive, there is also evidence for the use of finely woven, starched and burnished textile as a writing and painting substrate. The 1st century BC writer Strabo references the 4th century BC author Niarchos and writes that finely woven textile was used as a writing substrate in India. Little early examples survive, but there are many from later centuries when starched textile was used extensively for paintings. The Pichavai painting tradition of Rajasthan is a good example, and cotton was also used for larger paintings in the Mughal school of art, as shown in the example shown here. By the later medieval period, in large areas of South Asia, the use of paper had replaced palm leaf, birch bark, and textile as a writing substrate. The majority of scholars have seen papermaking as part of a group of technologies and innovations brought over during the period of Islamic expansion from the beginning of the 2nd millennium to Common Era. Dard Hunter, for example, suggested that papermaking in South Asia began around 1450 AD, when the Muslim ruler Zainul Abidin resettled papermakers from Samarkand in Central Asia into the region of Kashmir. A similar timeline is detailed by Alexandre Soterio, who supports the view that papermaking was introduced as a result of Muslim political expansion and describes paper as the gift of the conquerors. Soterio's study places a great emphasis on the oral histories of Ghazzi families who traced their ancestry in Central Asia and the great papermaking center of Samarkand. The close relationship between Central and South Asian paper-making traditions is agreed on by most paper historians. The migration of papermaking from Central Asia was catalyzed by the process of Muslim political expansion during the period between 997 and 1030, when the armies of Mahmud of Ghazni invaded India multiple times. Masatoshi Konishi adds a new perspective to the story by exploring the presence of papermaking in the coastal regions, such as Gujarat, which had an established trading link with the Arab world, predating the spread of Muslim political power from Central Asia. Pointing towards references to papermaking in early Jain texts, Konishi tentatively suggests that sackcloth used by seafaring merchants in the Gujarat region may have been used for the first locally produced papers of South Asia. Although Konishi adds another geocultural input into the story of papermaking, he also suggests paper may have been an imported commodity until the 14th century. An interesting alternative to Konishi and Soterio is provided by Jeremiah Losty, who suggests that paper may have been made and used much earlier in the Himalayan regions of South Asia. Losty cites the paper manuscripts found at Gilgit as evidence that papermaking was practiced in the Western Himalayas as early as the 6th century. Such an assertion requires an in-depth study of the Gilgit corpus of manuscript fragments in order to be verified. However, a number of Indian scholars have also drawn on classical Greek and Chinese sources to assert that papermaking was known in South Asia during the very first few centuries of the Common Era. Whilst historians have disagreed over the chronological origin of South Asian papermaking, they all agree that outside of Himalayan regions close to Tibet, it was not until the beginning of the second millennium that paper production in South Asia was to become a major craft industry. Although papermaking may have been practiced earlier in isolated regions, the rapid spread of papermaking from Central to South Asia was facilitated by the expansion of Muslim political power. The Punjab region in the northwest was at the heart of the story. The word Punjab is of Persian origin and only dates to the period of Persianate influence. For the sake of ease and consistency, I will use the word Punjab quite flexibly to describe the entire river basin of the Indus River complex throughout the span of history. Geographically, this was a region well suited to papermaking. At least 6 large glacier-fed rivers flowed in the Punjab from the Himalayas through the plains and into the Indian Ocean, providing a reliable, good quality water source. The larger known centres of papermaking in 19th century Punjab were all located close to rivers. These included the ancient towns of Sialkot, Lahore, and Multan. Sialkot is somewhere around here, and it's a very important name which is mentioned constantly by all historians studying South Asian papers. By the late 15th century, when Guru Nanak, the first Sikh Guru, began to inscribe hymns in praise of the divine, paper production was well established. Guru Nanak's poetry and that of the later Gurus is filled with references to paper being used for writing codices, as well as for everyday purposes. The phrase Dhan Su Kagad is derived from a longer passage composed by the first Sikh Guru, which translates as, "The paper, pen, ink pot, and ink are all blessed. The writer is blessed too, if they write the name of truth." From this quote began my fascination with papers used in Sikh manuscripts. The Sikh Gurus wrote sacred hymns on paper, and these were bound into codices, which are worshipped as the physical presence, manifestation of the Guru. The period of Sikh codex production stretches from the late 15th to the 20th century. This wide span of time meant that an analysis of Sikh manuscript papers would provide a rich sample of papermaking in the Punjab region primarily, but also beyond Punjab, as Sikh communities were spread quite widely across South Asia. I decided to focus primarily on Adi Guru Granth manuscripts, the most important group of all within the Sikh tradition. The large folio size of Adi Guru Granth manuscripts allowed for a richer data sample. Added to this is the existence of large numbers of dated Guru Granth manuscripts. However, other manuscript types were also sampled provided they were written in the Sikh Gurmukhi script. The data sample was drawn mainly from manuscripts in the UK and India-based collections, and the funding from the Frederick Bearman Research Grant was used to support a research trip to India in May 2018. The survey samples so far have been from collections in Amritsar in Punjab, India, as well as research libraries in the UK such as the British Library, the Bodleian, and smaller collections such as SOAS. The collection at Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar, was particularly significant due to its extraordinarily intact nature and wide chronological time span. As the research progresses, it is hoped that we will survey other collections in India as well as the UK. I will begin by outlining the survey methodology before describing the collections surveyed so far. The nature of the survey sheet was shaped by similar research projects on other paper types. This includes the research by Helen Loveday on Islamic papers, Elaine Wright on Persian papers, Evan Croft and Kathleen Baker on North African Syrian papers, and Jesper Trier's research on Nepalese papers. Studies of Western paper by Timothy Barrett and David van der Meulen were also important influences on my approach. Side A of the survey sheet was primarily focused on recording physical features, while Side B recorded additional codicological data. The survey procedure for Side A was as follows. Where possible, each manuscript was first photographed from above and also from the side to capture the tail end of the text block. A blank sample folio was selected, and care was taken to check that we did not photograph any text. The overall dimensions of this folio was measured with a tape measure. The same sample folio was photographed with transmitted light. An LED light pad was used for this purpose. Laid line concentration was counted at 3 different locations of the sample folio. The number of lines was counted over a distance of 20 millimeters. This was due to the occasional difficulty clearly discerning the lines within a 10 millimeter distance. Where possible, the distance between visible chain lines was also recorded, although this is quite rare. The thickness of the folio was measured at the lower, side, and upper edges with a digital thickness gauge. The opacity of the paper was measured using a field method developed by Henrietta Sharp Cockrell. This involves shining a 60-watt LED torch 15 centimeters away onto a folio with a wooden dowel positioned in front of it so that the shadow outline of the dowel could be seen through the paper. More folios were added until the outline becomes invisible. The number of folios required to make the dowel outline invisible was noted as the opacity factor. One-cell color tips from the soil color chart were used to record the color. Care was taken to avoid measuring the color at the very edge of the folio, as the color here was generally slightly darker due to dirt and greater levels of degradation. Finally, a Q-scope USB-powered microscope with a polarizing filter was used to take a micrograph in a representative location of sample folio. The process of analyzing the findings of the survey is still at an early stage, and there is much unfinished work in terms of organizing and digesting the data fully. Despite this, I will endeavor to provide a brief insight into some of the observations made so far. Although we recorded a wide range of features to categorize samples into defined paper types, it was important to separate the data into two main categories, being data related to paper molds construction and data related to fiber composition. Using the current sample of 50 specimens, paper and Sikh manuscripts can be sorted into at least 10 categories so far. This presents a far more complex picture than the simple division between Kashmiri and Sialkot papers described in many painting and manuscript catalogues. Certainly it is true that the Kashmir Valley and Sialkot were two important paper-making regions in the Greater Punjab area. However, paper was also being manufactured in other centres. For example, Lahore and Multan were recorded as paper-making centres during the colonial period. It is very likely that papermakers were active in other regions as well. Unfortunately, with the present data set, we cannot always associate the identified paper type to any particular region. A much larger body of data is required to draw such links. Nonetheless, we can certainly associate papers with differing styles of manufacture. Let's explore some of the identified paper types to provide a snapshot of the data gathered so far. Paper type A1. This was a paper type represented by only a single sample so far, sample 1. It is very important to start with this one. Sample 1 was from Guru Nanak Dev University, MS 1245, one of the most fragile yet captivating of all existing Sikh codices. He has been dated by some scholars between 1600 and 1604, making it one of the earliest known. I'll focus on analysing its colour and fibre appearance. The appearance of the fibres under the microscope shows large numbers of longer, darker coloured fibres due to which the paper has a darker appearance overall. A clue to the possible fibre type in use during this period can be found in the writings of Bhai Gurdas. Bhai Gurdas was a Sikh scribe who was close to the Sikh Gurus and wrote a number of poetic works from the late 16th to the early 17th century. In verse 19 of his 25th ballad, Bhai Gurdas provides a fascinating account of papermaking during this period, which sheds a great deal of light on methods and materials which were prevalent at that time. Using beautiful everyday Punjabi words, Bhai Gurdas poetically uses the maceration of sun fibres into pulp to form paper as a simile to explain the destruction of man's ego on the path of spiritual elevation. This is beautiful poetry, and Bhai Gurdas must have witnessed papermaking firsthand to describe the process with such vivid accuracy. The fact that he used the example of papermaking to explain spiritual concepts to everyday villagers is itself significant, as it suggests papermaking was commonly seen. There's a particular verse in which Bhai Gurdas describes the different artisans and communities of Punjab, which states that there are many countless potters, paper beaters, and salt workers, which shows a rich tradition of papermaking existed. Let's now return to the previous quote and understand the papermaking process which it describes. The first line of the quote describes a single field in which a crop called sun and cotton are both grown. Sun is a plant which is often mistakenly described as hemp due to the hemp-like fibre it produces. It is actually the Punjabi and Hindi common name for the plant Crotalaria junkia, which is actually a legume. As with other leguminous plants, sun has nitrogen-fixing capabilities and was used historically as a ground cover crop to replenish the soil between growing seasons. It could also be strategically placed in rows among other crops, perhaps to reduce soil exhaustion. My father, who grew up working as a farmer in the 1950s and 60s in Punjab, observed this method firsthand. The description of sun and cotton being grown in the same field is possibly a reference to the use of sun in this manner. Cotton is a crop which can exhaust the soil and reduce the fertility quite rapidly, so the growing of sun would make sense. Later on in the verse, Bhai Gurdas states that the outer layer of the sun is peeled away to reveal the bast fibres. These fibres are twisted to form ropes and cords, as well as woven mats. Finally, these cords and floor mats can be recycled to form pulp for paper making. In this way, Bhai Gurdas describes the journey of sun fibres from the plant to the paper sheet. There are a number of important points which can be derived from this single verse. Firstly, Bhai Gurdas does not make any mention of cotton as a fibre for paper making. Instead, it is described as a raw material for textile manufacture, and probably a material too expensive for paper makers to use. Secondly, recycled sun fibre is mentioned specifically as the primary fibre source. If we return to paper type A, made during the period of Bhai Gurdas, it may be possible to infer that the fibre type could well have been recycled sun and discarded ropes and cords. Unlike recycled clothing scraps, ropes and cords are not twisted especially finely or tightly, and therefore can be easily opened up during the beating process. Certainly the images taken of type A did not show any twisted threads or woven scraps, which suggests it could indeed have been made from recycled cords. But without further analysis of individual fibres, we cannot say for certain whether this is exclusively sun, because there were other plants used in the manufacture of cords, such as kanaf, the technical name for which is Hibiscus cannabinus, known in Punjab as patsan or sinukara. This is a much taller, robust plant than sun, which produces fibres used for thicker, heavier duty ropes. Looking at the micrograph and colour sample of paper type A, the presence of numerous darker, untwisted fibres is visible. The micrographs taken during the survey were an excellent tool for revealing how the subtle variations in colour between samples was a result of their fibre composition. Explaining the reasons for these subtle variations requires further technical analysis. It is likely that paper makers sorted fiber scraps into color categories, resulting in varying shades of paper. Sun, as with all bast fibers, can produce a range of colors depending on its region, soil chemistry, and also the maturity of the plant when it was harvested. As a very general rule, more mature fibers have a greener or browner quality, whereas less mature fibers are lighter in color. The fiber length and strength increases as the plant ripens, and since most sun was grown for the manufacture of ropes, it would have been beneficial to allow the plant to ripen fully before harvesting. Rope fiber would therefore have a naturally darker color. The dark color of paper type A1 certainly supports this hypothesis. The retching process and the use of natural or synthetic bleaching methods would also play a role, and much more research is needed to arrive at a better understanding of paper color. Continuing with the theme of color, the almost greyish-white colored paper types G1 and G2 were seen on a number of manuscripts dating from the very late 18th century to the late 19th century. Let's take sample 24 as an example. This completely intact manuscript from the Bodleian collection does not have a colophon, but does bear an inscription from 1857 when it was in the Milan Library collection. Its almost total absence of darker colored fibers is in contrast to paper type A1. It can be said with some accuracy that from the late 18th century onwards, a particular range of very light papers were produced, and they have not yet been observed on earlier manuscripts. It is interesting to note that almost all the samples categorized as G1 and G2 were in manuscripts which had signs of Kashmiri artistic influence. This can be seen in the use of decorated borders, which are box-shaped and frequently use bright yellow and orange pigments, typically seen in Kashmiri paintings. Certainly, the 19th century is a period when Kashmiri styles and products became more available in Punjab, as Kashmir had come under Sikh political control under the leadership of Maharaja Jasdip Singh. This era was marked by an influx of Kashmiri styles and handcrafts into the Punjab, so it is quite likely that Kashmiri papers also increased in popularity and availability during this period. In Dhan famous book on Indian papermaking, he includes a number of papermaking samples. The first sample in his collection is a paper manufactured in the city of Srinagar in the Kashmir Valley using a mixture of recycled sun and cotton textile scraps. This paper sample falls into category G1 based on its color and mold construction. The micrographs and transmitted light images reveal the extent of similarity between Hunter's sample and sample 24 from the survey. During his fieldwork in the early 20th century, Dad Hunter noted that the use and availability of cotton fibre was something which set the Kashmir tradition apart from paper makers of the Punjab plains and other regions. It is therefore possible the light appearance of sample 24 indicates the presence of cotton fibres. This tantalizing micrograph shows a stray fibre separated from the sheet surface, which could be interpreted to be a cotton fibre with a twisted ribbon-like appearance. Since the use of cotton scraps in paper making is specific to the Kashmir Valley, it is possible that paper types G1 and G2 may have been produced in Kashmir or by paper makers of Kashmiri origin operating in the Punjab plains. Despite this, we should be very careful not to declare that this is Kashmiri paper. At most, we can say that there is some evidence which suggests that pale-coloured paper, similar to that produced in the Kashmir Valley in the 20th century, is observed in some 19th century Sikh manuscripts. It is also entirely likely that the papers produced in the Kashmir Valley varied very greatly across space and time. The question of why Kashmir was the only region where cotton scraps were used in paper making requires further investigation. It is interesting to note that paper types G1 and G2, which correlate with Dad Hunter's cotton-based Kashmiri sample, are found in manuscripts which can be dated to the 19th century. In the history of South Asian textiles, this is a period when British colonial policy resulted in the decline of the indigenous hand-loom cotton industry, with the rise of British factories supplying South Asia with mass-produced cotton textile, mainly from mills in northern England. It is possible that prior to this period, cotton was considered too valuable for use in paper making. It is also likely that Kashmiri papermakers were closely influenced by the Central Asian and Persian traditions, where the use of cotton was already well established and widespread. I would like to briefly mention here that very recent research by Johann Solberg on papermaking in Uzbek regions has unearthed physical and anecdotal evidence of cotton-based papermaking being practiced. Moving away from the topic of color and fiber composition, let us explore the variations in mold construction. As mentioned earlier, the typology of paper types is constructed by grouping together similarities in fiber appearance and mold construction. South Asian papermaking molds consist of three main parts. The mold screen, shown here, the mold frame, shown here, and two local sticks being held by a papermaker you can't quite see standing in this house. Hunter was the first to try and explore the possibility of using the visible mold impression to categorize historical papers. He sought to use chain line concentration, as scholars of European paper have done, but felt quite frustrated after discovering that there was not a clear fixed pattern. Other authors, such as Superior, have seen chain and laid line patterns as an unlocked Rosetta Stone. Chain lines are difficult to observe and record in many South Asian papers, owing to the thinness of the horsehair or thread used in the mold construction process. We found instead that a greater emphasis can be placed on the concentration of laid lines. In our survey, we noticed that papers within a particular size and color range tended to fall within an identifiable range of laid line concentration. The choice and availability of different grass types had an effect on the concentration of laid lines. Narrower combs is a word which refers to the stem of the grass plant, would produce a finer mold screen, but would take a considerable amount of labour to produce. My own personal experiment at constructing a miniature twined grass mold screen took over 2 days to produce due to the time needed to collect, dry, trim, and twine together the columns. Although very shoddy in comparison to historic molds, it was quite a useful experiment in helping to understand the craftsmanship involved in twining the finest of all paper molds. The most extreme example of this is paper type B1. This paper type had an extraordinary 23 laid lines per 20 millimeters, which is almost double the concentration seen on other samples. It is astonishing to note that when one considers that each column in this sample would have been a millimeter wide or less. On one hand, constructing such a mold screen would be highly time consuming, but it would also enable the papermaker to produce a greater quantity of finer sheets, finer meaning thinner here, in the same amount of pulp. The desire for thinner, finer paper may have been a response to popular tastes, or even as a method of increasing efficiency by reducing the usage of pulp. The relationship between paper thickness and the fineness of the mold screen can be seen here. This graph shows a weak negative correlation between concentration of laid lines and sheet thickness. In stark contrast to the thin, fine, and well-burnished paper of type B1, paper type E2 sits at the opposite end of the spectrum. This rough, very fibrous paper can be found in sample 30 from a mid-18th century manuscript which was completed shortly after northern India was invaded by Nadir Shah of Persia in 1841. During the chaos of this invasion, major disruption would have been caused in cities such as Lahore, Multan, and Sialkot, where papermaking was central. And it is likely that finer qualities of paper may have become unavailable owing to these unstable times. The numerous unbeaten fiber clumps and low level of burnishing may indicate a lack of manpower in paper mills during this troubled period. As well as mold impressions, the estimated measurements of the mold screen are also extrapolated from the height and width of the folio. Variations in trimming and retrimming mean that these measurements can only produce an estimated set of measurements at best. Nonetheless, this is still important in helping us observe whether the mold had a vertically or horizontally biased shape. Paper samples which reveal similarities in mold construction could be grouped together. Type G1 and G2 papers are categorized by the especially large size of the mold screen, which measured as much as 71 centimeters wide and 84 centimeters long. South Asian mold screens were constructed by twining lengths of grass together, as shown earlier, using horsehair or vegetable fibres. The wider the mold screen, the longer the lengths of grass needed. Dhan states that the species of grass used for constructing mold screens was known as Andropogon lycanthus. More commonly used name for this plant grass is Capillipedium parviflorum. Along with some other species, this grass is found mainly in montane areas. Much more thorough research is needed, though, to determine the full range of plants which could have been used by mold makers. The portion of the plant used for the construction of mold screens is the culm, or stem, between two nodes. This means the width of each mold screen was shaped by the size of grass culms available amongst locally grown plants. Rooting with taller growing plants could make wider molds much more easily. A large sheet size could be achieved with a fewer number of harvested culms. Conversely, in regions with shorter grasses, in order to achieve wider, larger sheets, paper makers were limited by the shorter grass culms which were available. As a result, the easiest way to increase the sheet size would be to construct longer molds by using more grass culms to produce a more vertically balanced sheet. Paper makers could also widen their molds by joining together culms using the method shown in this diagram by Loban. But there was a limit to this, and it would be much more easier and structurally sound to simply increase the height of the screen. If we plot the sheet size against the relative height to width ratio of the mold screen, we can see a possible correlation, whereby the screen shape becomes more vertically biased as the screen size increases. This vertical tendency is an indication that paper makers found it easier to produce longer mold screens by adding in columns instead of wider ones which relied on complex joins. Paper types G1 and G2 achieved their large size by increasing the mold height through the addition of more columns in this way. Evidence from artworks must be used with great caution, but it's possible that the vertically biased mold screens seen in this image from 1850 of Kashmiri paper makers could be similar to the molds used for paper types G1 and G2. I will now briefly explore some of the more unusual materials and methods which were encountered during the research. An overriding feeling which emerged with the survey was the sheer level of diversity which can be seen in South Asian papers. There were a few specific examples I would like to share, which underline the extent of this diversity. The first feature I would like to share is the variety of drying methods. Drying paper on plastered walls and on lines is well known, but less well known is the practice of drying sheets on woven leaf mats of bamboo or other plants. Sample 8, belonging to paper type D2, showed a remarkable feature when viewed in baking light, which first caused me to explore this possibility. As you can see in these two photographs, the incredibly clear herringbone pattern caused by the damp sheet being pressed onto a patterned surface of some sort. The origin of this pattern became more clear when I saw an image of paper makers from Menan in West Bengal, photographed by Masutoshi Konishi in a survey of South Asian paper making. If other examples of paper with this surface pattern can be found, it may be possible to establish a time period or geographical area where this drying method was favoured over wall or line drying. The image here of Kashmiri paper makers from 1917 shows the more common practice of wall drying, which greatly affected the character of South Asian papers. We also recently came across an undocumented example of what appears to be direct creaching onto a plastered wall in a collection of paper-making images in the Sawas archive in London. This photograph from 1913, taken in the town of Aurangabad in South India, appears to show a quite elderly papermaker directly creaching a fresh sheet onto a wall with streams of water rushing down. It's not known whether this was a widespread practice, and South India was not a region covered in this part of the survey, but it would be very interesting to research this further. Another indication of the great diversity in the use of paper is that there were examples of paper made in regions located well outside the Sikh heartland of the Punjab. Sample 8A, belonging to a Bodleian manuscript, is a good example. The colophon of this manuscript mentions Nepal, and the paper itself exhibits all the typical features of Nepalese paper. The absence of a clear mold impression, the thickness and the long appearance of the fibers suggests it is a Himalayan type paper made in a fixed wove mold, with fibers possibly obtained from a variety of the daphne plant. This reminds us not to forget that Sikh manuscript creation was not confined to the Punjab area. The Himalayan tradition was closely related to the Tibetan one, in that woven molds were used to form paper using the poured method. In the micrograph shown here, you can also see woody non-cellulose particles, as well as evidence of a yellow stain applied to the paper. Further research is needed to determine whether Himalayan-type papers were used more widely. The Dhan Su Kagad project database currently comprises of 43 samples, which have been grouped into 10 paper types so far, based on similarities in fiber appearance and mold construction. In coming years, it is hoped that the number of samples in the database will expand, both in number and diversity. The majority of data samples so far were from Sikh Adi Granth manuscripts, and the aim will be to include representative groups of manuscripts from other traditions, such as the Indo-Persian, Jain, and the Kashmiri, just as examples. As well as expanding the body of data, there are plans underway to make the database of samples available online as a searchable database as part of the Legatus group of websites. This will enable scholars of South Asian manuscripts and artworks, especially those in India, to categorize papers they are studying by comparing them to known samples from the database. The project will also benefit the conservation of Sikh manuscripts overall, by drawing attention towards their materiality and the importance of their preservation. Paper is the ground on which the Sikh manuscript tradition was built. With this in mind, I would like to end with this quote from Guru Nanak, the first Guru of the Sikhs. My penance is the paper, your name is the insignia. A meditation on the metaphysical layers of meaning which can be derived from the transformation of fibers into paper. Thank you for listening.
Any questions? We're all keen to have a drink this evening. Jazz is very kindly provided bibliography, so I'd like to accompany the lecture this evening, which is available at the back. And also the Chantry Library will be providing a copy of it as well, so if you're interested in the future, you don't have to this evening to get in touch with them. Just a little bit about this year's round. Applications for the 2019 round are open, and up to £1,000 will be awarded to the successful applicant or applicants. It's open to any ICON member, not necessarily just Book Club Group members, or members and members who are undertaking or plan to undertake research in the area of book and paper conservation or benefit the areas of book and conservation. The applications will close on the 8th of February, and the successful applicant will present their proposal in a short form, just as Jasdip this year, and the paper group AGM in March. That just leaves me to thank our panel, David, Lizzie, Ilva, Andrew, and to welcome Flavio. Thank you very much to Rebecca Paper Group's Bursaries Officer, for her time and effort in the administrative process to make it run as smoothly as possible and to ensure that this idea became reality. Abby, for securing the reference fund project income so we can have this grant as well as possible. And thank you to all of you for coming here this evening to support Jazz and to remember Fred. And lastly, but by no means least, Justin, for speaking to us this evening and for your thorough and enjoyable research. I look forward to seeing you. Please join us for a gin tonic, which we serve at the back. Fred's favourite tip of things.
Thank you. I want to have tremendous lecture, Frederick Bearman. I learned an enormous amount, and pretty much everything in it was completely new to me. And that's what education, research, is really all about. And when I spoke at the beginning to introduce the series, I perhaps didn't make it clear enough that I want to thank everyone who has made this grant and this lecture series possible, primarily but not exclusively ICON and its members who have been absolutely terrific in facilitating this whole project, which I hope will continue for a very long time.